All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about how did the French Revolution lead to the ideas of nationalism, republicanism, and radicalism. So we've already been talking in class about liberalism and what it means to be conservative and free market economics and all that good stuff. And today we're going to be talking about the ideas of nationalism, republicanism, and radicalism. So I have a lot of questions here, not too many visuals, I apologize. But the first question is, how would nationalistic ideas spread? Now, nationalism is the most persuasive of these isms. And in Western Europe, in Great Britain, and in France, and in Spain, national identity would be aroused if their national interests were questioned. So like with the French Revolution, there was an intense sense of nationalism that developed. In Spain, the Spanish wanted to get the French out because why should the Spanish be ruled by the French? In Italy, Germany, Poland, and the Austrian and Turkish empires, the nationalities were divided. They were under foreign rule. So nationalism was a deliberate and conscious program in order to try to take back control over their own destinies because they were being controlled by a foreign power. So nationalistic writers or the intellectual elite, the intelligentsia, would use the printed word to spread this concept of nationalism. So schools would be teaching in the national language, and history would play a big role in the spreading of nationalistic ideas. So the idea of the shared history of the country helping to create a sense of nation. So the establishment of national languages. So we start to see more linguistic uniformity in European nations through things like books, newspapers, journals, magazines. These fix the language in a permanent fashion. Because when you think about a country, say, like Italy, which isn't united yet, but is moving towards that, you know, all the various different dialects that are spoken in Italy don't necessarily go together. But by having all of, books being written in the Italian language and magazines in the Italian language, that's really going to help to create one cohesive Italian language rather than all the various different dialects. So let's actually talk about what makes a group of people actually a nation. So the idea, if you believe in nationalism, is that all people of the same nationality should be under their own state and ruled by their own people, which would be very against empires, which is why the Austrians in the age of Metternich, the age after the Congress of Vienna, up until 1848 and the revolutions of 1848, a country like an empire like Austria would be very against nationalism because this idea that all people of the same nationality should be under their own state, ruled by their own people. So the idea also in nationalism is that the independence and freedom of other nations cannot lessen the freedom of another nation. So you're not supposed to harm another nation in your quest to have your own nation, which also, again, goes against the whole concept of an empire. But the problem that's created is what ethnic groups could be considered nations with claims to political autonomy. So what actually makes a group of people a nation? So a nation has to be a group that is large enough to support themselves with their own viable economy. They have to have history of a significant cultural association and possess a cultural elite, that could nourish and spread a national language. You have to have a national language, you have to have a shared sense of history, you have to be a large enough group that you can actually support a viable economy. You also had to have the capacity either to conquer other people or to establish and protect your own independence. So be able to have a military that can protect you from other countries. So with the state of Europe at this time, especially looking at Eastern Europe with the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, the concept of nationalism was very revolutionary. Many authorities persecuted nationalistic groups and they had to form secret societies. Members would be initiated with rituals to kind of impress the consequences of betraying the society's secrets. They would circulate forbidden literature and kind of maintain this revolutionary ferment because they were seen as going against these larger empires, especially in Eastern Europe. So now the next question is, how could nationalism and liberalism go together? So nationalism is going to join with liberalism and at sometimes socialism or revolutionary republicanism. So the way that nationalism and liberalism could go together is that they both supported a representative government, they both supported civil liberties and economic freedom, that nationalist groups felt that they could help gain the support of liberals in other places. Because liberty, which liberals support, liberty is synonymous with the love of a nation. And liberals and Democrats saw people as the ultimate source of the government, and you can't have a nation without people. And so the idea was self-government was possible if people were united by common traditions and loyalties. So it was easier to have a liberal government come to fruition in a country if they were united by common traditions and loyalties, because then they don't have these ethnic rivalries, religious rivalries, or linguistic rivalries that are kind of creating divisions. So now the fourth question, I know we're going kind of fast, how can nationalism turn into something ugly? So in Germany, the nationality almost becomes an obsession. So you have to have freedom and order and dignity. In order to that, you must have your own state. And the state becomes an institutional embodiment of reason and liberty. And history seemed to be the key to unlock this significance. You had to have this shared idea of history. You must look back at your past and say, this is what defines us and makes us a nation. Germans' universities became centers of historical learning. And they developed a cultural and political system that was different and contrary to the French, because that was their historical enemy throughout history. And now in Eastern Europe, because Eastern Europe in the last half of the 19th century, like I said, many different national groups and just a few empires kind of controlling them. So for Austria, if you look at this map here, we see all the various different nationalities within Austria. We see the Germans are in green. By no means are the majority of the group. Another major group was the Hungarians or the Magyars. And so in Eastern Europe, the Magyars and the Polish, because we talked many times that Poland gets wiped off the map, these had active political nationalists. And for the most part, they were focusing on this shared culture. Many groups in Eastern Europe, the upper classes either spoke German or they spoke French. And the native languages were peasant languages. And what actually kind of joined them and made them separate from the rest of the elites was peasant culture. And this was barely known in the rest of Europe because everyone kind of focused on, German or French culture. Patriots began to demand the preservation of their historic cultures. So when you think about all the various different fairy tales that you might have learned as a child or you saw in Disney movies or whatever, all of those fairy tales came out of either Hans Christian Andersen or the Brothers Grimm. What they both did is they traveled through Germany and they recorded and gathered all of the various different peasant stories that had been passed down through the centuries. These were by no means children's stories. And what happened over time is they became written down for the purpose of creating a sense of a common German national identity. So, all of this so far, the question is, how could nationalism turn to something ugly? Everything I've said so far is actually not ugly at all. But there is a negative side of nationalism, because nationalism will stress the differences amongst people. So you can't define the uniqueness of one people without comparing and contrasting them with another group of people. This concept of we and they being the enemy. So this idea that dominant national groups were regarded as oppressive. And so the most far-reaching revival of nationalism, which actually is going to turn into something ugly because it's going to turn into World War I, would be the Slavic revival of the concept of nation. But like I said, Austria would be the empire with the most issues with all these various different groups in one empire. So Emperor Franz Josef I, he's going to come to power after the Revolution of 1848. And he's going to rule up until after World War I, so he's going to be the last emperor of Austria. He's going to agree to something called the Compromise of 1867. And what the Compromise of 1867 does is it turns Austria into Austria-Hungary. Because if we go back to this picture here, this map, we see that the Hungarians were a pretty large group of people within Austria-Hungary. Within Austria. And so they had a strong sense of national identity, and they had been pushing for and demanding their rights for a very long time. In fact, the Revolution of 1848 was a revolution that was initiated by the Hungarians. So the compromise that was made in 1867 was the creation of a dual monarchy. So there would be a king of Austria, an emperor of Austria, and a king of Hungary. They would have separate parliaments, separate domestic systems, and they would come together as one in times of foreign policy. Now, the emperor of Austria and the king of Hungary was the same person, but they had separate parliaments. Now, the catch, though, for the Hungarians is you would think the Hungarians would be very sympathetic to the feelings of the other various different national groups within the empire, like the Ukrainians or the Czechs or the Croats, or if you look at any of these other people in this group. And actually, the Hungarians were like, well, we want power in this empire, but we also want power over the other people in our empire. So there was one point that the Austrians were willing to create a triple monarchy and expand some power to the Czechs. And that was actually blocked by the Hungarians. So it's like the Hungarians wanted more power for themselves, but they did not necessarily want to extend power to the other national groups within the empire. They wanted to be able to dominate over the people in the Eastern Empire, the Hungarian side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like the Austrians had always done to them. Russia is another example of an empire, with multiple nationalities there. And we see that Russia is expanding during the 19th century and is a heterogeneous empire as well. The vast majority of people, the Russians are the largest group, but they're not the only group. And so Nicholas I very much believes in autocracy, orthodoxy, and Russian nationalism. And then Alexander II, who was defeated in the Crimean War, who's also known as the Great Emancipator because of the emancipation of the serfs, also continued this policy of taking over land. Alexander III was very reactionary, and he tried to push this idea of Russification. He forced many Jews to migrate. He persecuted many of the Jews in the pogroms. And like I said, he really kind of emphasized the Russian language and Russian culture and kind of forced that upon the people within the Russian Empire. And here you can see where the German people, the Russian Jews were forced into. So he could see the forced migration of Russia's Jews, and he was very harsh and critical. The Jews had to carry passbooks. They weren't allowed to own property. There was all sorts of restrictions being placed upon them. And of course, the Ottoman Empire, another one of these multinational empires where, this is going to be a continual problem for them, is now in the late 19th century getting even sicker, kind of towards the end of their lifespan and about to die. But they also had to kind of repress all their various different national groups who were trying to fight against being under Ottoman control. So the last two questions we're going to focus on is what is radicalism and then what is republicanism. So radicalism originated in England in the 1820s by a bunch of groups who were known as the philosophical radicals. They were working class leaders and new industrial capitalists. Now, both of these groups were underrepresented in Parliament, especially in the 1820s. They really didn't have the right to vote. There's also a really messed up system in England because with all the urbanization that was happening with industrialization, and that's something that had never happened in England before, there was nothing in place to incorporate these new groups into Parliament. So you had some areas that, because of demographic shifts, had large populations but had no representation in Parliament, where contrasted with areas in the countryside that used to have large populations, but because of urbanization, so many people had moved out, had disproportionately more representation in Parliament. So they were kind of going against that. They wanted the reconstruction of laws. They wanted emphasis on poor relief, municipal organization, and getting rid of what they call these rotten boroughs. And these rotten boroughs are kind of what I just described. That these areas once had a large population, but now they no longer do, but they still have representation in Parliament reflecting of their old population. They were referred to as rotten boroughs. And so what the radicals wanted to do is they wanted to reform Parliament, and they were willing to even go so far as to abolish the royalty to have this happen, which is what made them radical. But they wanted universal male suffrage. They wanted every male having the right to vote. With the Reform Bill of 1832, the industrial capitalists did get representation in the vote, so they kind of turned into liberals, whereas the working class kind of remained the radicals. And then the last question we have is, what is republicanism? So republicanism is kind of basically radicalism on the continent. The first French Republic was a time of hope and potential progress in the eyes of the Republicans. They were a minority in France and Germany and Italy, but they mostly were the intelligentsia and the working class who were protesting injustice. They felt that they were repressed, and so as a result they met in secret societies and wanted to further the revolution. So like they weren't content at where the French Revolution had ended. They wanted to continue the revolution. They believed in political equality. They did favor a parliamentary government, but they were very much against the church because they felt the Catholic Church was the enemy of reason and liberty. They opposed a monarchy of any kind, and then they also opposed an aristocracy of any kind, and they really felt that they were the heirs to the French Revolution. And they were organized in national and then international societies, and they were not adverse to overthrowing the existing governments by force. And then you have even more militant Republicans, and they really were more anarchists. They were willing to kind of just like completely destroy the whole system. But so I want you to think about, how did the French Revolution create these movements, and would this bring disorder to Europe?